sort of full, VIP and just look around your house and do a tour of all that. Which did a beautiful job, man.
Thank you very
Now,
much.
when it comes to, I was always thinking when people write in isolation, it didn't do Dylan any harm, and Woodstock and Bowie when he did Low was at a low point in Berlin, and Bon Iver's off in his hut in the middle of nowhere to write about his heartbreak. So in a way, I don't know whether you found the isolation of the pandemic quite a spark, or whether it was tough going to deal with musically. And
we had no other option. We couldn't gig. It was very clear, and it became very clear at the start that there was no gigs, and we accepted that as well. There was no, how could there be? We didn't want to go into venues either, at this point. So we agreed with, but I felt the industry was badly kind of handled by a lot of the decision makers. They didn't really understand how the industry works. So we kind of just made a call very quickly, like, what do we do here? Do we get, really down about this, or do we actually see what we can do with our time? So we made an album, and I had just moved here, really. I just bought, I'm here now 12 months.
Right.
And that was in the kind of height of pretty strict lockdown. And that's when I started the record, because I was like thinking about doing it, and I was like, because it's a huge commitment to put a body of work together. It's easy to throw out songs, anyone can do that, but to put a body of work together, it's a different kind of thing. So I got to Greystones. I said to myself, like, between doing the DIY in this house and moving to a new place, I needed something that I loved and enjoyed, and was a completely a tangent to everything else in my life, which was making the album.
Well, I suppose it's touching on Bowie and Bon Iver, and that it affected the songwriting in a deep way, because they were dealing with being alone and dealing with a certain amount of that isolation. Did this influence your songwriting? Do you think there was a certain kind of tone that came across, or were you trying to counter that with what you felt was something much more positive and much more kind of uplifting? And
I'm not kind of one to counter. I think that that's more of an avoidance thing to do. The reality was, this was an absolute mess for everybody. Anybody, whether you had a job or not, it was still a mess. It was an absolutely intense period of time. Still is for many people. But I think for me it was, the album's called Sometimes We See More in the Dark, and it's actually about that during times like this, the intense times when you can't be with the people you love, and you kind of hit those lows and you hit those kind of walls, that's when you learn more about yourself. You don't, when everything's bright-sidey and great, Care Bears and unicorns and dancing around the meadow, it's great and it feels good, but you don't really learn a lot about yourself in those kind of situations. When you hit walls and you hit the floor, that's when you really start to gain what you're capable of, what you're made of, and that's what Sometimes We See More in the Dark's about. So it's quite a positive album, but it's dealing with what was a very difficult thing.
Well, that idea of you've been very forward. I know your book, me and my mate Jeffrey, given your kind of anxiety a name, that it's always been certainly through the last 10 years, a very kind of open part of you that deals with, what most people would the mental health area, most people would normally have shied away from. But it's wonderfully out in the open now that people just are able to express if things aren't quite right for them, and it isn't awesome and it isn't sunny. And is that something that you, I don't know whether it's a never-ending kind of journey, whether it's a feeling of you'll always have a certain degree of doubt and anxiety, or whether, given your success and given your life seems to be pretty good, I don't know if there is a sort of settling of that, so to speak. Or
there's tools that you learn and that you start to cope with, and I think there was periods in my life where it was quite intense and difficult, and I speak a lot about where it came from. It came from a very abusive school. I moved to Israel when I was 13 years of age. I lived on the border with Lebanon, and that in itself was something where I remember a kind of shift in myself, where I actually didn't feel safe. And then being in a primary school where, Christian Brother primary school, that was very physically abusive, you learn to just become hypervigilant. That becomes your default mode, because it serves you very well, and it's a good thing to be, because it's keep yourself safe. So I held on to that for years, and also I worry a lot. I worry about people a lot. That's where always my anxiety came from. But anxiety isn't stress. It's not, anxiety disorder is a different thing. It completely impedes on your life in every aspect: your sleep, your food, your relationships. It becomes very dysfunctional, which is what happened with me. Insomnia, panic disorders, and stuff like that. Now it's certainly something that is not a huge part of my life anymore, because I've spent years in therapy and years dealing with it and years finding ways to deal with it. But it's still, like every human being on earth, I deal with stuff. And a lot of people in this pandemic, when, I'm feeling really overwhelmed and anxious, I'm like, good, you should be. That's a really healthy response to what we've all gone through, and we shouldn't pathologicalize that. We should just be honest that if you're feeling tired and anxious and exhausted at this point, that's probably a healthy thing to feel, given everything that we've had to carry.
It kind of frightens me to think that I spoke to you before. This is when the Blizzard's debut album came out. This is October 2006, back in the Universal office in Dublin, and I'm wondering whether you would feel that kind of journey as Bressie will say has been, something that I don't know whether you kind of like have a slight distance as Niall from that, whether it's sort of just a fun thing that you do and it has its ups and downs, or I don't know, over the years it's just blurred as one big kind of happy life. But it always often feels that people in the entertainment industry kind of can be removed from that persona that they have to put out there or work with in a public way.
Yeah, I think it's a really good way of putting it. I think when you're in a band and when you're writing music and when you're performing music, there is always a certain different person that has to do that. My life is, I always said, like, sport is what I did, music is what I am, everything about it. I love music. My mum's a music teacher. I grew up around music. My brother's a music producer. I was given a piano at 5 years of age from my grandmother when my granddad died, and that was literally, he said the week he died, give it to him. I couldn't play anything. And it's just a huge part of my life. It is everything. And if it was taken, and that was the difficult thing in the pandemic, so was performing. Performing's part of that. Creating, writing, being with your mates is all part, but performing is a huge part of it. And that hasn't been there. So that's a release and something that I haven't had. And sometimes I also think, Paul, I think life gets very intense and serious for people, and we almost feel guilty to have an outlet and have a bit of fun. And that's what the band is for me. I take it seriously, but I don't take it seriously. I love it. It's a very important part of my life. But you're right, yeah, you have to create different mindsets for different things, because I do so many different things, and some of them require very serious reflections and conversations, and some of them don't. And I'm very lucky that I have both of that.
I'm thinking in 2009 when the initial kind of lineup of the Blizzard sort of took a break, a hiatus. You went off to Simon Fuller in London. You've been a songwriter, and you kind of had suddenly had other careers to think about. When Dec and Anto said, we're going to go back to Mullingar and run John Daly's bar, that idea of just sort of stepping out like Fergal Sharkey almost completely from the life that they had and just having a different life, was that kind of part of your thinking at any point that actually being in the public eye is just too much work? I don't know if that was always...
I don't think we were a big enough band to really have to deal with the public kind of the shite that some people have to deal with, but we weren't that big, I don't think. I think the big thing was we made a very clear distinction, because the lads had kids. Financially, it just wasn't working for us. We weren't in a position where we were able to support the people we loved, and that's just not a place you want to be, no matter what age you are. But the lads had a couple of kids and priorities started to shift. And I said to myself, like, I think we need to be honest with each other here. If this isn't working and we're not feeling it, we need to step back until we do feel it again. And that's what kept us together, because we didn't try to keep pushing through. And I'm a songwriter. It's what I've done, since I've retired from rugby. I've been songwriting, whether it's the Blizzards or for other people. And I got offered this amazing opportunity to go to London to work for Simon Fuller who's the Spice Girls. Yeah. Basically the guy who designed the Spice Girls and put them together, and biggest girl band of all time. So back in my head I was hoping one day I'd get to write for them, but I didn't. But yeah, I went over to London writing. Huge experience, tough experience. It is a horrible industry over there. The songwriting, not horrible is probably the wrong word, but it is very, very cliquey.
Because I'm thinking of the Brill Building and Neil Diamond and and Carole King and all these people are just bouncing around in between rooms, just writing these wonderful, wonderful songs. But I'm guessing there's the competitiveness side of it can create a certain amount of tribal.
And also the music industry's changed since then. The music industry is about production now, so it's about people who produce things and sounds, and it's the music industry always changes. But back in the Brill Building, you literally, that was a person on a piano who crafted this great song. I think the idea of song crafting like that isn't as much part of the industry now. It's very much production led, because the genres of music that people listen to now are very much production led. Like an awful lot of, the big hits at the moment, they wouldn't be massively melodic, but they're very catchy, they're very clever, they're brilliant produced. But it's not the sitting around the table and the bouncing around, the thing I'm good at.
Right.
That's when I'm good at a piano. I'm good at a guitar. I produced, I co-produced this Blizzards album, so I produce as well. But I find that area in especially the UK and America, it started to become almost factory line assembly. Like, you're good at this, so you do that. You're the guy who does melody, you do melody. You do the beats, you do the beats. You do the lyrics, you do the lyrics. I'm like, can we not all like that? That doesn't work for me. So that's my excuse for why I came home. But I miss my mammy. That was probably why.
I blame Sweden. They seem to just pioneered this idea of a production line that works for them and works for many people. But yeah.
You know, and I think they're at it. You know, a really interesting thing I read on Max Martin is that because you know, often as songwriters we get so caught up with lyric. It's such a big part of it. Whereas Sweden, they're more about melody.
Right.
Because English isn't generally their first language. So, but they're brilliant lyric writers because they get out of their own way a little bit. And they just go, that sounds really catchy, that sounds lovely. Like if you look at ABBA, sounds really good, sounds lovely, flows off the tongue, rock and roll, where we'd be like, that lyric's a bit cheesy and it wouldn't work. They don't care about that. And I think that's why they're such brilliant pop writers.
When it came to 2016 and putting the band back together, was that a kind of a long night's sleep of uncertainty about how this will work and, you know, what will we do and going back out there on the road? Or was it joyful? Was it a sense of, you know, this is what I've always, you know, want and need to do? So
it felt right. Yeah. That's the best way to put it. As I said, we kind of felt that we missed it. I'd done some solo stuff, didn't really like it. It's funny, the first solo album I put together, I wrote it for other people. I actually wrote one of the songs on it for Kylie Minogue. And it got dropped like third period French. So I was like, right, that's I had no money at that point. I was skint living in London because I wasn't getting the cuts I wanted. So then Sony came in and went, well, why don't you release it? We'll give you an album deal. I'm like, oh, okay. And this was before The Voice. Like, I genuinely at this point was like, I couldn't pay my rent. So I took the advance. But it wasn't me, that kind of music. I grew up in 90s rock land. That's how I grew up. That's the music I love. And so I felt I wanted to get back to that at the band. And I never felt more comfortable than with the band. And Deck especially, I grew up with him, our drummer. His parents, his mum and my mum were best mates. Known him since I was 2-3 years of age. You know, I mean, Louise is in the band, my partner, which is amazing. And it's tested, you know, it can be challenging too with your partners in the band. But I think she's brought a new creative energy to the band that I don't know if we'd still be together or we would have kept going without that new creative energy that's been brought to the band.
Well, we should say the album's out on May 13th. You've got your biggest show in 3 years at the Dublin Academy on the 14th, and you will be in Greystones then on the 15th for an interview with the wonderful Andrea Splendori in the Whale. But people can actually grab a bus from Greystones into the gig.
Yeah, it was actually Ian. I trained, and when I moved here, like I took me ages to get, like, I was quite nervous when I came to Greystones. I actually had my first rugby cap, international cap, was here in Greystones. I had a very lovely affiliation to the Greystones Rugby Club because of that. My dad was in Bressie. He's from Donegal. He was in the army, but he was sent to Bressie, and he kind of has this love affair with Greystones. So when I told him I was moving here, it made his life, like, he just wants somewhere to go. I think it's one of his favourite places in Ireland. So I'm delighted to have. But the other thing, I came and started training with Ian there in Go Gym and in CrossFit, and just got on with him. He goes, listen, we're bringing a big team. We're putting a bus on from the Go Gym at 6:30 on. So the bus is leaving at 6:30 on the Saturday into town. So if you want to have a few drinks, you have someone to drive you there, drive you back for literally a tenth of the price of a taxi, and bring you back to Greystones after the show. So that's the headline show. But also then we do in the Whale on the Sunday night, which I'm really looking forward to because we're talking about the album a little bit. And I've been in the Whale a few times. What an asset to have. Beautiful place.
Like. I think it's still, for some people, it still kind of has to find its feet for them because I think it's in a town of 20,000 plus. You know, the idea that this beautiful venue exists and that, you know, 70 people is a good sort of full house. It can still be a struggle to draw people in because I think there's a sort of disconnect people have made in the last few years, especially over the pandemic, about going out. There's a sort of still a... And also you have this thing when you're living in Greystones, or even Mullingar where I'm from, it's like, we'll go to Dublin. I'm like, no, like, Dublin's got lovely theatres, but it's here. Sure. Sometimes we look outward all the time and something exists like that here. And some of the acts that I've seen they've got since I've been here anyway are like, they're big acts that to see them in that venue is a real gift. I think the other thing with Greystones as well is that it's got this, you know, I think it has so many options. People forget how, like, that's the one thing I feel kind of, I get anxious sometimes because like there's so many things I could do. So last weekend was like bank holiday
And I'm thinking something, or the weekend before, and I'm sitting here going, like, there's so much I could actually do. But I ended up just sitting on my arse here doing nothing, which is terrible. But yeah, I do. I haven't explored it enough. And yeah, I think to me, I moved here because I sensed there was a strong community. And I think there's a lot I can bring for the work that I do to a community. At Us for Life, our charities now in 900 primary schools. I'm very passionate about the work we're doing within mental health and education. So that's something I wanted to tap into. And although I am from Mullingar, I've kind of made Greystones my home now, which was terrifying, but the right thing to do, I think.
Beautiful.